Welcome to the Yeoman Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Graham. I'm excited to have with me today Professor Lenny Wells, University of Georgia professor of horticulture and pecanology. He is joining me from their campus in Tifton, Georgia, which, if you're unfamiliar with the wonderful state of Georgia, is, I don't know, maybe hour and 45 minutes southeast of Atlanta. Is that about right?
It's a little more than that. It's probably close to 3 hours.
Oh, okay, a good ways down there. I'm excited to talk to Lenny. I've followed him for a long time on Twitter. I would encourage y'all to do that. His handle is, he's the Orchard Keeper. His handle is keeper_orchard. And have wanted to just generally chat with him for a while about pecans. But, I should have started with the trigger warning. In this podcast, we are going to use the correct pronunciation of pecan. So, as my grandmother said, a pecan is what you take out back when the toilets broke. We're going to say pecan, so I hope that doesn't bother some of our listeners. Are you all right with that, Lenny?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
All right. But what prompted me to ask him to join me for this conversation was a very recent article that he's published both on his own website, which is lennywellswords.com, Thoughts from the Orchard, and also published, I think, to a wider audience via the Front Porch Republic. The article is The Full Life of Empty Rural Spain. Lenny, in addition to being having an orchard here in Georgia, advising to pecan growers, being a professor, he's also, it sounds like, and we'll get into this, done some regular consulting to a pecan grower in Spain. And he had some wonderful thoughts about comparing his experiences over there, his observations there, with here in the United States. And I think we'll start there and then go into other aspects of his work here in the United States. Lenny, thank you very much for joining us.
Sure. Thanks for asking.
I'm going to begin with a quote from this article, and you can find it again on his website or Front Porch Republic. Or I'm going to read a paragraph from it, and we'll go from there. Lenny writes, "Spain is a fascinating place for someone interested in the relationships between people and land. These relationships are inevitably shaped by history. Comparisons with the landscape and culture of my home in rural Georgia reveal stark differences in climate and the land itself, as well as in the cultures of each place. In the part of the world where I'm from, it's still the dream of most people to live on a place of their own in the countryside, surrounded by woods and fields, away from the hustle and bluster of the urban lifestyle. But beneath the obvious differences, I see similarities. Even though many of us in the U.S. want to live in the countryside, there remains a bias in certain circles that assumes the rural dweller is the backwoods hick. Farmland is increasingly concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. The same market forces and economies of scale that drive this consolidation in Spain make it hard for the small farmers in the U.S. to survive and hold on to their land. We've each arrived here by different paths, but we have both arrived here nonetheless." I think that's a beautiful and accurate paragraph, and we'll kind of dive into that. So can we start with what brings you to Spain on a regular basis?
Well, of course, in my job at the University of Georgia as the pecan specialist for the state of Georgia, I hear from, of course, I help pecan growers here in Georgia with their issues and problems, and then I hear from people all over the world, asking questions about pecans. And I've had opportunities in the past to visit other countries, where pecans are grown, and see some of that. And I've had opportunities to sort of be a consultant for people like that, but I've always in the past turned that down because I didn't feel it was fair to the growers here You know, also how it affects our markets here when other countries become big and compete, basically. And that's going to happen, regardless of whether I help or not. But I generally didn't want to, contribute to that any more than I would, in a professional manner through my job anyway. But this opportunity with the grower in Spain was a little different. Spain, they're famous for their citrus, their almonds, their olives. There's some walnuts over there, but there's not much pecan. And I don't think there really ever will be a lot of pecan production there. This particular grower has roughly around 300 acres of pecans, which probably makes him the largest pecan producer in Spain. But that's not his primary business. And his primary business kind of gives him some contacts with some of the larger grocery chains over there. And so he has a way to get his product into those markets. And the way I looked at it is, if I could help him with his operation and he could help to build the market in Europe for pecans, then that could also help us here in the U.S. And it wouldn't really be any competition because, like I said, I don't think Spain's pecan acreage and production is ever going to be anything to rival, what we have here in the U.S. So it looked like a good opportunity to kind of do some good in both areas. And so I've taken advantage of that. And in doing so, it's given me the opportunity to experience that culture in Spain, which I'm very somewhat enamored with, I guess you could say. I find it very interesting and really a good way of life from what I see. Mm-hmm. And so I've been doing that for 3 or 4 years now, going over there once a year and kind of working on that. And
how long are you there each time?
I'm usually only there for a week or so, 7 to 10 days, somewhere in that range. Just to travel, takes a couple of days. But get to meet people there and talk with them and kind of see how they live and exchange ideas. And it's been beneficial for all of us, I think.
How long have, the pecan is our native nut tree. Your mm-hmm. The title of your recent book, like last year, maybe? When did
it's actually, I think 2017 is when that.
Oh, okay. Well, it came on my radar screen just a year ago. Yeah. But how long are pecans grown widely outside of North America?
Wider than most people realize. Yeah. Of course, the U.S. is the largest producer historically. Probably over the last 5 to 10 years, Mexico has also become mm-hmm. Equally as large. Mexico and the U.S. each produce about 300 million pounds a year.
So that's shelled or unshelled?
That's in shell. Mm-hmm. In shell. And then so, U.S. and Mexico are the two biggest producers. The next largest producer is South Africa. Mm-hmm. And then you have the South American acreage, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Peru are also growing. And then Australia has some production. There's some actually in Israel, or historically there has been some in Israel. And then for the most part, that's about it. There's some in China. We don't know to what extent. It's hard to kind of get an idea of the acreage there and the production. But there is some being grown in China now. but that, for the most part, is kind of the world supply of pecans.
And we here in Georgia are the largest producer among the states here. Is that right?
Yes, among the U.S. states, Georgia is usually the largest producer. We produce about a third of the pecans grown in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when we have a down year, pecans being a perennial crop, they are subject to some alternate bearing. And sometimes if we have a down year, New Mexico actually kind of takes that top spot. But most years, Georgia comes out on top on the production.
This is a bit of a tangent, and I want to get back to Spain, but I've always been I don't understand why Georgia is not the pecan state. I mean,
that's a good question.
We grow peaches here theoretically, but South Carolina, if I'm correct, is a considerably larger grower, and maybe not even the biggest grower. And I love Georgia. I'm native Georgia, but South Carolina peaches are better than Georgia peaches.
Well,
we kind of own the pecan thing, so why are we not?
I won't dip too far into the peaches, but I think that's more the fact that it's called the peach state is more of a historical thing than a current production, because our pecan production is certainly much larger than the peach production here now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, so Spain, in your time there, now I think you said 3 years for a week or more each time.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that experience helped you, or you remark on some differences and some similarities you put in here about rural life here in the United States, the life of a farmer in the United States versus that kind of the peer life in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And don't let me put words in your mouth, but I think you observe that most people live in villages in Spain and they go out to their farm rather than living on the farm. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, from what I've observed, there's the biggest contrast to me in just looking at the landscape and people's relationship with it there. Here, of course, in the U.S. and certainly here in the Southeast, as I mentioned in that paragraph, is kind of the dream of a lot of people to have a place out in the country and live on the land, and be kind of somewhat isolated to themselves to some extent, but I think more so than the isolation from the population in general, it's more just a feeling of freedom that I think is innate to Americans. Is we want that room, and that's been kind of one of the driving forces for, historically that was one of the driving forces for, the spread of the population in our country is people wanting land and moving further and further west, which of course brings in other issues along with that. But in Spain, you don't see that. At least I don't when I'm there. People are content to live in close quarters with each other in the villages. And as you get out into the countryside, you don't see many houses that people are currently living in the countryside. There's different reasons, I think, for that. But I think one of the biggest ones is cultural. And I think it's the Spanish people enjoy being around each other, and the social aspect of their lives is very much a part of that culture, and is very important to them. And so they enjoy being in close contact with one another, as opposed to somewhat more isolated as we are here. So you don't see a lot of houses on the countryside. Even those that work the land tend to live in the villages. which is, of course, somewhat different than what we see here.
I think there's a biblical reference to that. I think when God was commanding, I'm going to totally get this wrong. This is a quote my brother shared with me. When God was commanding Moses, maybe, on how to lay out towns, it was very much the village, then surrounded by agriculture, and the agriculture that we prescribed was an acreage that would support a certain amount in the village, but village living was the kind of the standard.
Right.
And and you may or may not know anything about this, but I think that's kind of like how things have evolved, and how agriculture has kind of been historically in the United States is a bit of an outlier. Is that right?
I would say so. I mean, if you look in the case of Spain, a lot of their situation, as far as that goes right now, is also has a historical base to it. It goes back to really to the Romans, I think, when the Romans had control of Spain. And that gets that'll kind of move us somewhat into the similarities, because that model for land use, as I understand it, as the Romans conquered Spain, or that Iberian Peninsula, of course they set up agriculture, which some of what was already there from the Phoenicians, I believe, but that's when olive production and grape production in Spain really took off, was through the Romans, because they were producing this for the legions that were there to support them. But a lot of the land ended up being owned by the wealthy, the senators, the Roman senators, and also those who helped conquer the area. And so that's kind of how that relationship between wealth and land kind of took off there. But also it was based on a pattern that was already taking place back in Rome, for how they set it up there. And so you had the wealthy that were the owners of the land. You had the people working on the land, which often, again, wouldn't really live there. They lived more in the villages. And so it was just kind of set up historically that way. And through the years, even though, who controls the land, to the extent of, political issues, all that through the years is still kind of filtered down to that same sort of model in a somewhat different way, but it still looks the same. So
the people working the land, it's kind of a peasant. You describe it in your article, but it's essentially a peasant model. Right. They were working it. There was I imagine there was a certain amount of the proceeds that needed to go to the landowner in the form of rent, I guess we would call it. Is that right? And then the rest they kept.
Yeah, and I'm sure that was heavily weighted toward the the landowner. And of course we see, our history, we've seen similar things here. And
in a sharecropping type.
Yeah, sharecropping is the perfect example. And we continue to see, I think we see more of a shift in that direction now here in different ways than what we saw back in the sharecropping era. But, now it's things are shifting more towards corporate farming, and it makes it harder for smaller farmers to maintain, their landscape. And so, and you see a similar thing, in the modern era in Spain. You see more, a lot of the wealthy people are who own the land. Very rarely do they live on the land. They live. A lot of them live in. Some of them live in the rural villages, but then also you see them living in places like Seville or Madrid, in larger cities. And then they're worked increasingly, like here, by immigrant labor. As far as the people who do the actual work on the land. So that's kind of where the similarities are drawn. And we each, as I mentioned in the article, we each have arrived at a similar place, even though we've come by a little bit different means. It's been sort of parallel, but a little bit different.
Is that consolidation that we see in industrial agriculture? Do we see that also among pecan growers?
Yes. It's a little more recent than what it is for much of our major crops. But yeah, we do see we have large investment groups that own pecan acreage, and that's becoming, as I said, more frequent. And I think given the cost of production now is so high, it's very difficult for small farmers to hold on to it, and almost impossible for a small farmer to get into it, at least on a commercial scale.
Because of the cost of land?
Cost of land, cost of equipment, cost of, the inputs that go into growing it, water.
What would be a small, like a small, I don't even know how you would measure it in terms of number of trees or acreage or whatever.
Acreage.
What would be the smallest feasible commercial farm?
I get that question a lot, and it changes. It's hard to answer sometimes, but I would say to be a full-time pecan farmer, where that was your only source of income, currently you would probably need 300 to 500 acres to do that. And probably anything less, you're probably going to need some other source of income coming in.
And how many trees would that be?
You roughly 30 trees to the acre. So, what's that, 150,000 if you're 500 acres. So
when I drive through Georgia or South Carolina and drive through or by, beautiful. I mean, the pecan tree is a beautiful tree. It's really a beautiful tree. And so if you haven't driven past a pecan, you would notice if you drove by a pecan orchard, because they're just gorgeous. It's, and I think we'll probably talk a bit into kind of contemporary pecan growing methods. I don't know if trees that are pruned the way that they are now would look the same way, but they're just gorgeous. They're a bit like, if you know what a live oak looks like, a bit like that, and evenly spaced and spread out. It's just kind of really, really pretty. But so when I'm driving by and I see those trees, are those people growing commercially, or they just have them growing?
Once you get below Macon, most of what you see it's going to be probably commercial acreage. That's most of our pecan production is in the coastal plain. So when you get just south of Macon, you get around Byron, that area around Perry. From there south, that's where most of the pecan production. So yeah, anything you see along there, usually commercial production. And as you mentioned, some of the pruning techniques that are used now, because as you mentioned, pecan trees do get so large. one of the issues that we have, this may get into the weeds a little bit off of our topic, but, pecan trees get so large that they tend to compete with each other and they produce a lot of shade and shade each other out. So one of the challenges for commercial production is to maintain that sunlight in the orchard for production purposes.
You also have to get the tree to the point where it will produce, which is
yes,
a decade or so before you have
roughly. I mean, they'll start producing some nuts year 5, enough to harvest year 5 or 6, but it's usually year 8 to 10 before you really are getting a good harvest. But usually, depending on the tree spacing, you may have to start to manage that sunlight year 12 to 15, usually. If somebody's planting a lot tighter, you may have to even start doing that year 6 or 7. But in general, it's year 12 or 15. And you either do that. Historically, it was done by just cutting trees out, removing trees. Now
so you would still have ever larger trees,
right? Less trees just continues to grow. Now we manage that somewhat by the pruning method. There's a large machine called a hedge pruner that we go in and basically cut all the growth that extends out beyond a certain point, usually 6 or 7 feet away from the trunk, all the way down the tree row. We'll cut everything off that extends beyond that. And then we kind of angle cut the top to where it's more kind of like a house shape. And to bring the height down. And so this controls the size of the tree. It also helps. We've learned that it helps with the water status of that tree or the water efficiency of that tree, so they can stay hydrated a little easier because there's less tree for those roots to feed. And the nuts are usually larger and better quality nuts in that situation. But you do sacrifice a little production for that, but that also helps to manage that alternate bearing cycle that we tend to have.
On the going to come back a little bit to this theme of consolidation. What do you see as the various forces driving that consolidation? You mentioned one, I guess, private investment groups or private equity are buying places. Like eventually, I imagine those returns aren't. I imagine the economies of scale will begin to decline after a certain point.
Yes,
but what are other things? And you've been in this now for how long?
Since 2000. I first started working with pecans around 2003. So a little over 20 years.
And so what are some other things you see happening that are driving consolidation? Because my sense is this has been happening since before we were born.
Yeah, it has been. And so on the surface, you've got, as I mentioned, the cost of production being high, the prices generally being low. We had a period not that long ago in the pecan world where our prices basically jumped up really high for a period from about, I'd say, 2009 or 10 to 2018. And the driving force behind that was China really got into the pecan market. And at one point they were buying as much as 80 million pounds a year from us. And
of our, I think did you say 300 million pounds?
Yeah, the 300 million pound crop, they were buying 80 million, so almost a third of it. And
this, did the Chinese people sort of become exposed to and develop a taste for pecans at that time?
They did. That came about because there was a year, I forget exactly, I think it was around 2007 or so, 8, somewhere in there. For the first time, I think the price of pecans fell below the price of walnuts.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of the driving force for them to try pecans. And when they did, they found out they liked them.
Yeah,
And
because they're objectively better.
yeah, they're much better than walnut. So when that happened, they developed an interest and immediately started. They went from buying like 3 or 4 million pounds a year to buying 20 million pounds, 30 million pounds, and it just kept ramping up. The demand was huge. And when that happened, they weren't just buying shelled pecan kernels. They were buying in-shell nuts, because in China, one of the things they like to do is sit around kind of in the winter and crack nuts open and eat them. And so they were buying in-shell nuts, and they were selling them cracked but in the shell, and they could just pick them out and eat them. So that developed an in-shell market, a very large in-shell market, which directly benefited the farmers, rather than the kind of the middleman, the sheller. And so that immediately doubled the price of pecans. So the average price of pecans went from something like $1.20 something a pound to, close to $3 a pound. And, that continued on. And that when we were in that era, we had a lot of people, deciding to plant pecan trees and getting into the pecan business.
Was that also happening in China, where like growers there being like, "Hey, we should start growing some pecans"?
It started happening, but it was like I said, it's hard to find out exactly what goes on there. But from what we could see, it looked like, it's not easy. It's not, pecans aren't that easy of a crop to grow. It's not like you just go plant a tree and come back and pick up nuts. There's a lot that goes into it.
That's what we did growing up. That's what we did.
Yeah.
The pick up nuts part.
So it took China a while to figure out exactly, how to grow them. So initially, like one of the biggest issues with pecans is zinc. They need a lot of zinc. And so, they discovered the whole zinc deficiency issue. So, but they're figuring out more and more how to grow them. So that production over there has grown, and it's going to probably continue to grow. But in the meantime, as we know, it takes pecans several years to come into production. So in the meantime, the prices were booming here. The pecan industry was booming here. It was growing. Our acreage here in Georgia was it went from 140,000 acres to 200,000 acres just within a few years. And of course, some of our hurricanes have taken care of some of that, unfortunately. But so along with that, we were seeing people, that's when we started seeing the large investment companies get in to the pecan industry. But also during that time, the prices would support smaller growers to plant, 15, 10, 20, 25 acres of pecans. And you could make some extra money doing that. You could afford to plant them and make some extra money doing that. But now, really with the 2018, with the tariffs took place, it just immediately cut the price of pecans in half again, because that in-shell market, that large in-shell market, was gone.
These were these Chinese tariffs on our?
Yeah, of course, in retaliation to the tariffs that the U.S. put on them, they put tariffs back on us, and so just the whole trade war thing kind of blew up the pecan market. And since then, as I mentioned, prices have dropped, and they've gone back to being like most agricultural commodities. They're just high enough to where they kind of keep people in it, but there's
Yeah,
hard
you've
to make
already
what
made
you
all
do.
these investments. You've
Right.
invested in,
Yeah.
creating it. So,
And so that brings up challenges. There are, I feel there still are ways for small growers to make it, uh, with pecans. But it's difficult. As I mentioned, you've got to have an additional source of income. And I think I saw a statistic to where it's like just farms in general. I think it's like 80 something percent of farmers have off farm income. And I think that's a
mhm.
necessity. Certainly for a small grower right now, there's no way to do it without that. But, um, for pecans, you need the off farm income. You need to grow varieties that are resistant to disease, because that's where, at least here in the Southeast, that's where most of our input and our cost of production is trying to control the diseases that come from our rainy, humid weather. Um, so you've got to have those resistant varieties. Um, but I think that one of the biggest things is you've got to explore alternative markets and become a little more vertically integrated, and kind of do some marketing of your own pecans, because commercially in the commercial market, the grower grows the pecans, farmer grows the pecans, and then they're usually bought by either a accumulator or a sheller. And then the sheller shells the nuts and sells the kernels to like the Costco's and Walmarts and all that. Um, and if you go that normal route, that's where the prices that the grower gets are low. But if you look at, what's called the food dollar, um, one of the largest percentages of that food dollar goes to the ones who, um, are processing and marketing that product. And so that's where there's an opportunity, I think, for growers or farmers to get into that part of it. It's not easy. It adds a whole other layer into their operation, and you really need it's almost another full-time job for them. But if they can process, that crop or whatever they're growing, in this case, pecans, shell the nuts, sell the shelled kernel, because that's what people want to eat. Um, Sometimes they, roast and salt the nuts, or cover them with chocolate, or
Mm-hmm.
cinnamon and sugar or something. And then find a market. It doesn't have to be a huge market. What I usually tell most growers is, even if, no matter what your acreage that you're growing, whether it's 10 acres or 1,000 acres, take a certain percentage, whatever you feel comfortable with, whether it's 1% or 10% of your crop, and try to develop an alternative market for that. Because when you do, and it generally takes about 3 years to build that up. But when it happens, you're going to be getting at least twice, when you convert it back to an in-shell price for pecans, you're going to be getting at least twice the amount of money you would have gotten just selling into the commercial market, because you're dealing with the end user. And that is really, I think, key to small
Mm-hmm.
farmers surviving, is doing some direct marketing.
Probably across not just
Yeah,
for pecans,
not just
but across
pecans.
the board.
It may be a little harder with some other crops and other things that you're growing, and I'm not as familiar with those in those markets, but I do know for pecans it can certainly be done.
Thinking about direct to consumer, when I was a kid, I don't know that we ever bought pecans, and it was mainly because my grandparents just had two big trees on their place in Commerce,
Yeah.
and I don't know how many hours of my life I've spent picking up pecans, but it was a great many. And I recall, uh, I recall that was sort of the gift that just these two trees. It was and it was so many pecans. They never ever in the world could they eat them all or give them all to family members. They were gifts that they would give to other people. They would. I don't know that it was actual barter, but it was often they would be receiving other things, and handing out a grocery bag full of pecans.
Yeah.
But we never were. I mean, we never would have been, just never ever would have bought pecans because
Right.
they were always around.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's still certainly down here. You still see that as part of the culture. A lot of people still have pecans in their yard, and a lot of people still do that. But one of the keys to I think the direct marketing now in the era that we live in now, it's a little easier if you can utilize that thing that we all that has such an influence on our lives anyway, the internet.
yeah,
You know, you can. That's a way to access a lot of people, and certainly where pecans are grown, you may have fewer customers. But there's a lot of places in the U.S. where they don't really even still know what pecans are. And usually when they
or
try
how to
them,
pronounce them.
yeah. And usually when they try them, they like them. So that's
How big? So I'm curious about that change or that evolution in taste. It was not long ago before we were born, but I understand it. The predominant nut tree in America is the chestnut, and I imagine the chestnut blight and the destruction of virtually all of our chestnut trees here opened up an enormous market for pecans commercially. Is there any truth to that?
I've never really looked into that as far as historically what effect the blight, the chestnut blight, actually had on the pecan market. That'd be an interesting thing to examine, because it actually kind of, I think all that kind of started happening. If you look at pecan industry in Georgia, it kind of started serendipitously as sort of a land scheme back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where you had, northern investors coming down. You had a few companies that would come down, buy up land, plant it in pecan trees, and then they would sell it off in these little 5-acre chunks. And I've got copies of old advertisements that they were advertising, 5 acres of pecans. Support your family, send your children to college on this 5 acres of pecans. and of course, people, there's suckers
5
in every
acres would have
generation.
been 100 plus trees. Is that
Yeah,
right?
so they bought the little 5-acre plots, and soon realized that wasn't the case. That wasn't going to happen. And so then,
Yeah, that period of time, the southern, the land speculation in South Georgia and Florida
really,
was wild stories.
yeah.
Maybe I'll do an episode with someone who really understands that history, but the crazy development schemes that were going on way back then to get
right. I've got some of
lands.
that in that pecan book that you mentioned.
Oh, good.
But so, when those little investments failed, and all of a sudden there's all these little 5-acre plots that are all contiguous to each other, that are, that people are losing, and people with money can come in and buy them up for the taxes, and so then these large blocks of pecan orchards were bought by people down around the Albany area, and just south of there in Camilla and Leesburg, just to the north. And that
they
kind
were
of
just
became,
assembling them one by one,
yeah.
like one, yeah.
And so that kind of became that area over there around Albany kind of became the pecan center of Georgia. And then similar things were happening in other communities throughout South Georgia. And so they said, well, we've got this now, so let's just try to develop some market for it. And it eventually took off. So, but yeah, all that occurred probably around the same time that the chestnut blight was taking out the chestnuts. So yeah, there may be some connection there. I've never thought about that.
And the pecan, how far north where does the range effectively end for
the native range
for like where a commercial grower, like where does it stop, and then where would it? Like we have plenty of pecans in Atlanta; they're just all over Atlanta.
Right. The commercial production is generally along that southern tier of states, all the way from, say North Carolina, all the way across to California. And so, but the native range of pecan really goes from down near Oaxaca, Mexico, so pretty far south into Mexico, all the way up into Texas and into Oklahoma, the tributaries there from some of those rivers in eastern to central Texas. And then from the, Mississippi River all the way from basically New Orleans all the way up to Iowa. You can find, in the native population, you can find pecan trees. So they're very
not into the Appalachians, like you wouldn't. It
wouldn't not
be
so much. No, not so much. But the pecan is very adaptable to a wide range of climates and conditions. I think they could be grown, in the Appalachians, certainly certain varieties. We have varieties that we call the northern varieties that you see grown even commercially around Kansas, northern Oklahoma, that are going to be more cold adapted. Some of those probably have they'd have a shorter growing season, so that may work in the Appalachians some as well. But yeah, generally most of it is in the coastal plain. You have some that reaches up into the Piedmont region, but once you get into the mountains, you don't see any really commercial production in those areas.
Imagine it'd be harder too, even just the nature of the land.
Yeah, just the landscape, I think, would be challenging. Yeah.
Well, on the consolidation, the market emerged or became a market in the early 1900s. It sounds like, and then and farms have been started tiny, but that didn't work. Then there's some consolidation there. What is I wonder if has agriculture policy impacted that?
Absolutely, and more so. I think. I think it's been. Earlier, we were talking some about Wendell Berry, and I think that kind of brings some of his thoughts into this. And
I imagine his nemesis too, or one of his nemesis, Earl Butz.
Mr. Butz. Yeah. So yeah, around that era, that Earl Butz era, the Nixon administration, or I think it all kind of started after World War II, but I think it really ramped up during that time. It just kind of became the agricultural policy in this country to get big or get out was kind of the phrase that was used. And
that was just for listeners. That was the policy actual phrase. Like that was the commandment from the federal government to all farmers.
Yeah.
We don't want you farming unless you're big.
From the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, that was verbatim. During that time. And so I think at that, with that philosophy, it promoted agribusiness more so than agriculture. and that has led to some of that consolidation. So you had, your large companies that are primarily the benefits of that benefit, the ones who benefit from that. And I think that the current model that we have here, and really pretty much all over the world for the most part, at this point, that's just still kind of the driving factor, in it. And it's hard to combat that.
You mentioned briefly Wendell Berry, and I didn't mean to distract you. Berry is still living, but has been writing both fiction and nonfiction on this topic for many decades. How old is he? Is he at 90?
I think he's around 90. Yeah, I think he just turned 90.
But still writing. Can you? He was maybe one of the early critics of. So we came out of World War II and this sort of organization man mentality and this new industry period where things could be centrally planned and operated on much larger scales. It was kind of a mindset. And our agriculture policy, maybe many of our policies that we live with today that we just sort of accept as is, or sort of grew out of that mentality. And Barry writes and began writing about this and talking about this in a, sounding the alarm bells many decades ago. But could you share a little bit about his kind of some of his messages? I don't want you to speak for him, but and how it relates to this consolidation.
Yeah, so he was one of the first really to point out some of the problems with, or at least the first to garner a lot of attention for pointing out a lot of the problems that policy generated. Certainly, it helped to allow us to be much more productive as far as producing the volume of agricultural products we could produce. It certainly ramped that up to just unbelievable levels. But along with that, there were casualties of that. One being the rural culture, the social life of rural areas. That's when you started to see rural towns that start to die and shrink and kind of dry up in places. All of that is pretty much a direct result of that because of that consolidation, and the money was not staying in the communities, it was leaving. And so he was one of the first to point that out. And he had grown up in Kentucky and in tobacco country and around tobacco growing people. And he saw firsthand the effect that had on them. He just a little background on him, and I'm certainly not going to claim to be an expert on him, but he went off to Stanford to the writing program there, and then eventually I think went to teach in New York and spent some time overseas as well. And at some point, I think when he was still in New York teaching, he kind of realized, he and his wife realized that they wanted to kind of be back home or back at his home in Kentucky. And people thought he was crazy for leaving his teaching position at the time. And he moved back home and was able to support himself through writing and through small scale farming. And I've had the fortune to meet him one time. And from what I could see, he certainly lives what he preaches. And he's continued to be through like you say, decades, a strong advocate for rural places, rural people, and just pointing out that while there's a lot of benefits to, uh, there can be a lot of benefits to the ways that we live now. There's also issues that we need to think about as we go forward, and we need to pay attention to those. And that's kind of his, his whole thing. And I won't go into try to put words in his mouth or go into the details of all of it. I think I've pretty much read most everything he's written to this point or published to this point. And
I think you said it pretty well. It's an agribusiness now rather than an agriculture.
Yeah. And that's that aspect is what I think makes it most difficult for small farmers, because that kind of lends credibility to the whole "get big or get out" mantra that they used. And you've got those economies of scale and those economic forces that are hard to overcome for a lot of growers.
I wonder, I've mentioned this a couple times, and I think I need to do a deep dive on it. I'm not sure I'm totally accurate about this, but I'm still working out my ideas. Earl Butz was to agriculture what Robert Moses was to land use and development, and I kind of feel like the economies of scale became much the scale at which you could continue growing an operation got much bigger with the introduction of our huge expanded distribution network, supply chain system, particularly the interstate highway system. Like a grower their market for selling their goods, particularly a perishable good, got way bigger with the creation of the interstate highway system, and then also probably refrigerated rail and things like that, which was a very modern thing and emerged from a similar mentality that gave birth to the interstate highway system. Also sort of a kind of little bit progressive era, post-war era thing where like, hey, the federal government needs to get involved in helping things get really, really big.
Mm-hmm.
And absent that, I wonder if, Barry would have been needing to write any of this kind of stuff, if he would have been needing to call, like if it would have been as economically feasible to operate something at such a large scale, because your market had gotten, you now can sell to China. A lot of the Earl Butz industrial policy grew out of a pursuit of global trade. Is that right?
Yeah. I think that's accurate. And your comment there is interesting, because I never thought as much as, certainly that's part of growing making more markets available to farmers would have been that whole interstate system and all that, and refrigerated rail. But I kind of see a parallel now to that with the internet. Making more markets available. And in a way, it's not going to offset it, because that was such a large scale thing, the interstate system and the refrigerated rail. But interestingly, I think that does provide more of an opportunity for the small farmer to market their product. But they have to have the computer savvy to figure all that out, or the money to pay somebody to do it.
And two, the tools are becoming more and more egalitarian, I guess. As they're built better and better, they become easier and easier for anybody to use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That
reminds me, I remember my dad introduced me to spreadsheets when I was young, and I think if Ashley Fitzgerald hears this, she'll probably hold it against me. But I love spreadsheets. I'd really just enjoy modeling out things. And my dad introduced them to me when I was young. Spreadsheet was invented by this guy, Dan Bricklin, I think in the late 70s. But my dad's take on the spreadsheet was that it gave the small business owner, it gave the yeoman entrepreneur the ability to bring sort of a financial awareness to what he was doing that had only previously been available to people who had legions of analysts,
Right.
bookkeepers, CPAs, and things. Like just one person could do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm of the mind that there's a great deal of technology, and as you say, with the internet opening up markets to small people, there's a great deal of technology that's very disruptive to in large scale industry in favor of small operators.
Yeah. And that's one thing, technology, you know, I'm getting to the age where a lot of it is starting to, I'm just kind of letting a lot of it just move on without me.
A friend of mine says that technology is solving a problem I choose not to have.
Yeah, that's kind of where I am with some of it. But I do see, and I think a lot of people in the whole agriculture world, especially the world that Wendell Berry is advocating for, there's a big push for everything to be organic and regenerative and all this. And I'm kind of, those labels kind of stick in my craw a little bit, because I don't think we need to have, this form of agriculture, that form of agriculture, another form of agriculture, and put all these labels on them. My goal would be for all of agriculture to just be, for lack of a better word, more sustainable. Sustainable is an overused word, but I think it's one that has merit when you really apply the real definition to it. But as far as I certainly, organic is great, and I like to see it. I don't think it's suited to every environment, every location, every crop. And not just with that, but even the technologies that we see coming out, with precision agriculture and drones and all this stuff. Well, a lot of that is kind of starting to get beyond me. I do see a place for it. But again, I think it kind of also brings that whole agribusiness thing into it again, to where, at least initially, the cost of that is often so high that it's only the large farmers that can participate in that. But I think there's certainly aspects of technology in our current technologies that we have that could be integrated into a more sustainable system. I'm not one for completely throwing out all of technology and saying we've got to do it. We've got to go back to doing it like we were doing it in the 20s. I think there's certainly aspects of that, and mainly the things that we need from that era are the attention to local conditions and local land, soils, and environments, and paying more attention to that rather than trying to make everything a cookie cutter approach to how we grow whatever crop we're talking about. The local aspect of things, I think, has to be brought back into it. But I think we can merge some of the technology that's available with that to improve on all of it from all aspects. So we're at a unique time for sure, where we have all these things kind of converging, and bringing attention to that is something that I think is needed.
I think that's really well said, and optimism, and I also sense a great deal of hopefulness in that. Like, we're at a time where maybe maybe smaller people wanting to serve a more local market have have technologies available to them that will enable them to do that in a competitive way that is simply not. It's hard for an extremely large operation to deliver a good that comes with some soul and heart and attention to their immediate community
Yeah.
to it. Like at a certain point, scale becomes a disadvantage in some ways for
Mm-hmm.
folks. So,
Yeah, I think, and that's one of the things I think that has been lost is with this development of technology and precision agriculture and AI and drones and all this stuff. I think it does put pressure on it's kind of pushing people to kind of rely on that sort of thing too much. Well, I think it's certainly a tool that we could use. I don't want us to rely too much on it. I'm a firm believer that if you're going to be a farmer and you're going to grow something, to be successful, you have to spend time. Your boot prints in that field are going to what is going to be what determines whether it's successful or not. If you're just relying on, looking at your phone to see what the soil moisture is today and turning your irrigation on from that, or
mm,
just looking at all of it on a computer, those are tools, and they shouldn't be, the main force behind the way you operate. You've got to spend time in that field to really understand what's going on and to really be able to appropriately manage it, for not just for the crop production, but for the health of the land as well.
I would think you could take exactly that and apply it to exactly what you just said and apply it to pretty much or maybe every industry.
Yeah.
And you'd be given a good synopsis of one of the things I'm trying to get at with the Yeoman podcast.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about your own orchard?
Yeah. So, I grew up, of course, in a rural area. The town I grew up in, mostly is Cordele, Georgia, which is about 30 or 40 miles north of where I live now in Tifton, here. And while at the time my father did not farm, my grandfather did not farm at that time, but our family, my grandfather and his brothers and sisters all had my great grandfather's farm. At that time, when I was growing up, it was still undivided among all of them. It was around 1,500 acres or so. And like I said, my grandfather didn't farm. They leased the farm out to another farmer. My great grandfather was the last one of us to farm it. But sometime probably in the late 80s, they decided to divide up the land among them. And so they did that, and it was still, and still today is kind of all one consolidated thing, even though each part of the family has their own block of land or whatever. But I spent a lot of time out there growing up, mostly going out there with my grandfather and fishing, or we'd hunt for arrowheads in the fields, and I would go hunting there with my dad and my uncles, and so I spent a lot of time there growing up. And I remember just my grandfather died around 98, somewhere around that time. And I think it was one of the last times we ever went out to the farm together. We were riding down kind of the main field road there that's kind of on the central part of the farm. And, it was kind of on the part that was around his, kind of overlooking his part of the farm. And I remember he asked me, because he knew he didn't have long. And he asked me, he said, do you think you'll ever sell this place? And at the time, I had no intention of farming, but I had a love for the place, And I told him, I said, it'll never be sold if I can help it. And
How old were you?
I was in 98. I was in graduate school. I was working on my PhD at that time. So, yeah, I was probably in my early 20s to mid 20s, somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, after he passed away, the land went to my dad and I, basically. And then, after I finished my PhD, I was working here as a postdoc, working on peanuts and tobacco with a disease called tomato spotted wilt virus that attacks those crops and tomatoes. And I did that for a couple of years, and I got married around that time. And my wife is from another town that's nearby here, and her family's a farming family, rural area, and all my life, even though I loved, our farm and all that, and I loved spending time out there, as like a lot of kids growing up in rural areas, the main goal was to get out, go.
Yeah.
I want to get away from this place and live somewhere else, But then, and I had opportunities around that time. I had a few job offers, and but my wife and I just got married, and we just decided, we like it here. This is a good place, I think, to raise a family, and we like this place. So, made the decision to stay here. And but my postdoc was running out pretty soon, so I took a job as an extension agent, a county extension agent over in Albany, in the pecan capital of Georgia. And that's really where I first started working with pecans and pecan farmers. And after doing that for a year or two and kind of seeing how pecans were grown and having some understanding of that, and kind of started thinking to myself, I said, I think I could do that. and I had discovered Wendell Berry by that time. I had been reading, and honestly, a lot of his writing had a lot to do with my decision to stay here.
I can see that. Yeah.
And so I said, I love the farm, but I kind of want to be more actively involved in it, And so talked with my dad about all that. And we decided to take 25 acres of our part of the farm that was dry land, and he agreed to let me plant pecans on it and start growing pecans. And that was initially all I wanted. I just wanted 25 acres to just to have something to do, to work on the farm and spend time out there, and have a little extra money from it. And that was 2005 when I planted that orchard. And of course, as we've discussed, when you plant a pecan orchard, you've still got a few years before you've got anything coming in from that. And there was an orchard on our farm that actually one of my grandfather's sisters owned, that my great grandfather had planted back in the 20s or something like that. And nobody was really working it. And so I talked to her about, can I kind of take care of these pecans and manage those until mine come into production and all that, to kind of have some income. She was like, yeah. So we worked out something on that. And so I was a pecan producer. And then things like this never happened to me. So was in it for about 5 years. Things are going along, and it's a struggle to get everything off the ground. You're putting so much money in, and you've got very little coming back, and all that. And then around 2010, the China thing hit, and the price went up, and all of a sudden, I was finally able to bring in some money, and I decided at that time.
Were you still an extension agent?
I'm still an extension agent at that time, so it's not a full-time thing. It's 25 acres. It was doable, and then that was another. My aunt's orchard was another 15 or so acres, so it was manageable. And then when the market took off, and I said, well, if I'm ever going to grow the acreage more than what I've got, this is the time to do it. And then when the price, and I knew at some point the price was going to come back down. So then when the price comes back down, I'll have the additional acreage that will help with the income. And so that's what I did. Started planting more, bought farm, planted it. I had actually at one time leased another orchard. And so tried to grow the farm while times were good. And that worked out. And I got up to 100 acres of pecans, and realized that was kind of my limit, that I could take care of the way I felt like it needed to be taken care of and still do my full-time job. So that's kind of how that all took place. And it's been good for me. And I mentioned earlier about the direct marketing thing. So when the whole tariff situation happened and the price dropped, I kind of started, that was one of in my full-time job in advising other pecan growers, that was one of my things, was advising them to do some direct marketing. And so I said, well, telling everybody else to do this, I need to try it too. So, I started doing that. I have several different varieties of pecans that I grow. One variety is called Elliott, which is an old variety. It has excellent disease resistance and has for over 100 years. So you really don't hardly have to spray these at all. And I said, I'll take this variety. I've got 10 acres of them. I'll take these and I'll start shelling a few of these every year and trying to build a direct market with that. And so that's kind of when I also got on Twitter, was mainly to try to help build a market for my pecans. And I developed a website for that. And it took about 3 years. And it just started taking off. And I went from shelling like 1,500 pounds of in-shell an acre, which gives you roughly 750 pounds of shelled nuts, shelled meat. And now I'm shelling 10,000 pounds. And that's, again, I realized that's kind of my limit. That's kind of where, because I'm doing all this myself, all the taking the orders and back, packaging them up, shipping them off, all that.
And how much weight do you sell per what is an order?
On the website, you can buy them either in 3 pounds or 5 pounds. They're packaged individually in 1 pound packs. So you can buy them in 3 pounds at a time, or 5 pounds or more at a time. And so, I'm doing all that myself. I'm going to the post office every day, shipping pecans and all that too. Trying to do my job, trying to manage the farm and all that too. So I stay busy. But it's worked out great. And I've enjoyed it. It's given me a great life. I feel like I'm where I should be. as far as
how much of your business is direct to consumer?
only so out of that 100 acres, only that 10 acres, so roughly 10% of my operation, I do direct marketing. I feel like I
imagine,
could
though,
grow.
it's disproportionately large percentage of your margin, though.
Yes, it helps dramatically with the whole the bottom line. When you take 10% of what you're growing and direct market it helps tremendously. It's exponentially helpful in the bottom line. So yeah, that's been good.
When you say you shell them, like you shell them, how does that happen? How does it go from
that's another whole
pecan?
aspect. So one of the issues for a small farmer is the fact that if you go into the processing side of it, or you're selling a product directly, you've got food safety laws that are going to go into effect, that you've got to deal with. For a small farmer of pecans, anyway, I hire out the shelling. So I've got someone a few miles away that has a commercial shelling operation that they shell the nuts for me and bag them, and I just pay them the cost of the shelling and the bags. But because the processing takes place kind of in their facility, the food safety aspect, they have to be, for their operation, they have to be certified for all these food safety regulations.
So USDA certified.
Yeah. And that's a very costly and expensive and time-consuming headache. But it's necessary.
Would you say you're fortunate to be so close to a facility like
very
that?
Much. That makes it.
Yeah.
I really couldn't do it without that. And so they do the shelling and the food safety because when I pick it up from them, they're in sealed bags. So the food safety aspect is covered under them. Of course, if there was an issue, heaven forbid, it would certainly impact my business, but from a legal standpoint, it falls back on them. But I don't foresee that happening, and certainly hope it never.
Thing with pecans, I don't think of like people getting.
It's very rare.
Like lettuce, I hear about lettuce.
Yeah, pecans are unique because they come in that shell, and inside that shell you have what we call packing tissue that is kind of just sort of like a woody type material that's inside.
You can eat it, but it tastes like
it's kind of bitter. And but that material has some, of course, they're protected inside that shell, but that packing material also has antimicrobial properties to it that helps protect it as well. Of course, when you shell it, you're losing that.
And to be clear, when you're saying the packaging material, you mean God's packing.
God's packing material inside that.
If you've never shelled your own pecan, if you've shelled your own pecan before, it's obvious what Lenny's talking about. Yeah.
And so, but for pecans, you rarely see any kind of food safety issues.
Yeah. So you take them to that operation, shells them in packages for them, packaging, and then you do your own fulfillment though. So you go get them and bring them to you.
I go pick them up. I'm also fortunate that a very good friend of mine has a large walk-in cooler. And so when I go pick them up at the sheller, he lets me store them in his cooler, which I've got to. That's my next step, is getting my own cooler. And so,
how long will an unshelled in a cool, dry, dark place?
Right.
How long will a pecan keep in its shell, and what's the shelf life once they're shelled?
The key to that begins at harvest. When we harvest them, they're generally going to be anywhere from 5 to 8% moisture, and then they get when we take them, so when we harvest them, we take them to a cleaning plant that separates the nuts from all the sticks and leaves and everything else. And so,
so in my experience of harvesting pecans, I walk around and pick them up off the ground, or if we're really high tech, we have a little poker picker uppery thing that, so we don't have to bend down. Yep. I imagine that's not what's happening with your operation.
No, in a commercial operation, what you've got is, so you've got a big machine called a shaker. It's got a big claw on it and goes through the orchard, grabs the tree, shakes it, nuts fall off. Then you go through.
Do they fall into a net?
No, they fall onto the ground. And so then you go through with a tractor that on the front of the tractor is what we call a sweeper. And it's like almost like a big rolling drum, like you see, kind of a leaf sweeper, like you see for yards, picking up leaves with, but it's just larger. And it's mounted on the tractor, and as you go through, it's mounted on the front of the tractor, and it sweeps the nuts in one direction so that you don't run over the nuts as you're driving. And then on the back of the tractor, you've got what's called a blower. It's just a big fan, and it blows the nuts that are directly in the tree row that you're driving beside. It blows them across the row out to the other side. And then you just drive through the orchard, sweeping and blowing those nuts into a windrow. And then you come through with the tractor and the harvester that picks the nuts up in that windrow. And so then they go into a big wagon. We take the wagon to the cleaning plant, where there it's separated out to separate the nuts from all the debris. And these are normally commercial. Some large growers have their own cleaning plants, but most farmers take them to commercial cleaning plant. And that's another thing, is that we have those here. We have the infrastructure in this part of the world to have that. So you have them cleaned, and then you pick them up. They're dried down in the cleaning plant. They check the moisture. And if it's usually above 4%, they'll dry them on down to 4%. And then I pick them up, take them to the sheller. And then actually at the sheller, they have to soak them. They run them through a hot water bath and a chlorine bath to kind of sanitize the outer shell. But before they can crack them, they've got to soak the nuts a little bit. And then they crack them, shell them out.
They just soak them in water? What do they?
Yeah, the shell is just soaked in water just to make it a little softer for the cracking.
For my own pecans that I get, like whatever from a friend or something, if I soaked them before, would that make them easier to crack?
I wouldn't, because these are soaked in. They have to be soaked kind of in hot water. That hot water bath is a key step to sanitizing that shell. I don't think if just cracking a few at home, I don't think you need to soak them, but it's more for the machinery that does the cracking. But they are, so they're bagged, dry. That time of year when this is taking place is normally October, November, December, so it's cold, cooler. So the temperature is not as much of an issue. But then when I pick them up from there, they could stay at room temperature in those conditions, say in the winter, maybe for a month or two. I wouldn't want to keep them beyond that before you start seeing maybe a little color change in the kernel. Yeah, they get a little darker. Doesn't really affect the taste, but you do see them start to get darker. So I pick them up from there, take them, put them in our cooler, and the cooler is at around 35 degrees, so just above freezing. And of course they're dry in there. And that's the key, is temperature and keep the moisture out. And in that condition, they'll stay roughly a year before you start to see that color change. you can put them in the freezer and they'll last longer. Maybe, I've got some in my freezer at home that've been there for 3 or 4 years, and take them out and they're fine. But generally in refrigeration, I wouldn't want to keep them ideally more than 6 or 8 months. But they will last up to a year most of the time.
How about the pecans you pick up off the ground and put in your
same. The key to that is going to be drying them, getting them dry.
Yeah.
But I think if you just pick up a grocery sack full or something, you could kind of spread those out on the kitchen counter probably for a few days, and they'd be fine. And then, I would store those. I'd probably, if I was going to store those, they will actually store longer in the shell. So if you say put them in the freezer in the shell and then crack them when you get them out, they'll last longer, but you can crack them, put the kernels in the freezer, and they'll last for, certainly a year or two.
Yeah. Pecans are kind of an amazing food. Like I'm surprised they're not more of a staple of people's diets, given how
they've been
incredibly nutritious. They're like this self-contained sort of thing.
Yeah, pecans are, the way I describe it is pecans as far as the whole, so pecans have only been what we could say are domesticated for, 100 years or so, just over 100 years. And so everything about pecans, the production side of it, the marketing side of it, all of it is in the dark ages compared to most other crops.
Like olives or almonds or
even almonds or walnuts, pecans are just not as well known because they haven't been utilized on a large scale for very long. So we have the pecan industry now has a federal marketing order that helps to promote pecans. So and we've seen that help some as well. But there's still a point, places in the U.S. that don't know anything about pecans. And certainly if they do know something about pecans, most people associate pecans with nothing more than pecan pie. That's the big thing has always been pecan pie. And when you eat them in a pecan pie, it's not just the pecan you're eating, but you're eating the Karo syrup and everything else that goes into making that pie, which may not be the most healthy way to eat pecans. But if you just look at the pecan itself, it has a world of health benefits. I mean, it's high in fiber, several important vitamins, K, A, I think C. You've got a lot high protein. Yes, it has fat in it, but it's what's called the good fat. That it helps. There's been studies that have shown that it helps to lower your blood pressure. It helps with, it's a heart healthy recommended food. Has a lot of antioxidant properties to it. So there's a lot of benefits, health benefits to eating pecans. So
it really doesn't. It still makes no sense to me that Georgia's not the pecan state.
We've got to work on that. So
yeah. Lenny, you've given me more time than I asked of you. I'm grateful to you for joining us. Can you share? I shared a bit I shared this at the beginning, but can you tell people where to find you and also where to find your pecans too? We didn't reference that.
I can be found a lot of places. If you just Google me on internet, you'd get me. But you can email me through my UGA email, or I do a little bit of writing on the side, just mainly for my own enjoyment that I do. I think you mentioned the website earlier, lennywellswords.com. And then, my pecans can be found at limestonecreekpecans.com. So, yeah, I'm around.
Well, it's been great to chat with you. I'm grateful to you for joining me on Yeoman. Learned a ton.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, sir.
I've enjoyed it.